In this section, we're going to learn about triangles. The first thing you need to know about triangles is that the sum of the measures of the interior angles of a triangle is 180. So that means this angle plus this angle plus this angle for any triangle, those three measures will equal 180. So we may not know what the three measures are, but we know they equal 180. Let's look at an example of how we might use that information. In this example, we have a word problem telling us that if we have one angle of a triangle that is 38 degrees and the other two are congruent, we can basically figure out the measure of the congruent angles. So we're going to start by setting this up as an equation. So we know that angle 1, we can call them whatever we want, that angle 1 is 38 degrees, angle 2 is some amount we don't know, and angle 3 is also that same amount that we don't know. So 2 and 3 are congruent. You could have labeled the angles however you'd like. So we know the sum of those three angles equals 180 degrees. So I'm going to create an equation. Angle 1 plus angle 2 plus angle 3 equals 180. And now I'm going to substitute what I know for 1, 2, and 3. So when I do that, I get 38 degrees plus x equals 180 degrees. We don't have to keep the degree symbols in our equation as we're solving. So x plus x equals 2x, and we get 2x plus 38 equals 180. So we're going to subtract 38 from both sides or add the opposite so that we can get rid of that 38. And when we do, we also have to subtract it from the other side. So we're subtracting 38 from both sides, and we end up with 2x equals 142. So then we're going to divide both sides by 2 in order to solve for x. And when we do that, we find that x equals 71 degrees. Now, if we know what x is, we know what two of the angles are, and we can check to make sure that all three angles add up to 180. And sure enough, 71 plus 71 equals 142 plus 38 equals 180. So we can double check to make sure that we have the correct answer. There are 6 types of triangles we're going to study this year. We're going to classify triangles by their angles as well as by their sides. So let's start by classifying triangles by their angles. First, we have an acute triangle, which has 3 acute angles. A right triangle that has exactly 1 right angle. And we have an obtuse angle, which has an obtuse triangle has exactly 1 obtuse angle. Now, right triangles and obtuse triangles still have acute angles. They only have 2 acute angles, however. So keep that in mind. So you have to have 3 acute angles to have an acute triangle. Triangles that are classified by their sides include a scaling triangle, which doesn't have any congruent. Isosceles triangle is 2 sides congruent. And an equilateral triangle, which has all 3 sides congruent. Now, one of the things that's interesting about these triangles is that even though we're classifying them by their sides, we also know something about their angles. The same number of angles will be congruent as side or congruent. In a scaling triangle, none of the angles are going to be congruent to each other. In an isosceles triangle, something very interesting happens, and that is that the angles across from the congruent sides are congruent. So this angle across from that side and the right angles across from the left-hand congruent side. So those 2 angles are congruent to each other. In an equilateral triangle, since 3 sides are congruent, all 3 angles are congruent. So one of the things we want to do with isosceles triangles, 2 out of the 3 angles are congruent, is we want to be able to identify which 2 angles are congruent. It's always the angles opposite the sides that are congruent. So I'm going to go through and identify the angles that are congruent in each picture. In this picture, at the bottom left, this angle is across from that side. This angle is across from that side. So they're congruent. In this picture right here in the middle, this angle is across from the side, and then if you follow this red one over here, those 2 are congruent. And then in this last picture, the top left and the top right are congruent to each other if you were to follow the congruent sides across from each other. One way you can think about it if you have a hard time seeing it is the two sides that are congruent actually form a point. The two sides that are congruent form a point, or an angle rather. They form an angle. That angle is the one that's not going to be congruent to anything else. So the two sides that are congruent form an angle, and that's the angle that is not congruent to any of the other angles. So the two sides that are congruent form an angle, and that angle is not going to be congruent to any of the others. Again, you can see it right here. These two sides are congruent. They form an angle. That angle is not congruent to any of the other angles. So this is just a different way to look at the same information. So you can see that interior angles of triangles, which are three-sided polygons, add up to 180 degrees. When you classify by sides, we have scalene, isosceles, and equilateral triangles. No sides congruent, two sides congruent, three sides congruent. No angles congruent, two angles congruent, three angles congruent. When we classify by angles, we have an acute triangle, which has three acute angles, a right triangle, which has one right angle, and an obtuse triangle, which has one obtuse angle. So let's do an activity and see if you can figure out which would go where. So what you would do here is figure out which of these angles is an acute triangle, a scalene triangle, isosceles, obtuse, etc. And they could be more than one. So if I drag this one, notice you can drag it over and over again. This looks like an isosceles, so I'm going to put it right here. And notice I can drag it again. So I've identified it by its sides. It has two sides that are congruent. Well, what about its angles? It looks like an acute triangle to me, so I'd also classify it by its angles. So try this activity and then check your answer sheet and see how you do. In this next activity, we're going to find the missing angle for each triangle and classify it according to sides and angles. So in the first example, we have the angles of 75 and 25, and we're looking for the third. So you just add 75 plus 25 together, and then you subtract that from 180. And when you do that, you'll get 80 degrees. So this is an acute triangle, and it's also scalene. Since the sides are, since all the angles are acute, it's acute, and since all the angles are not congruent, then none of the sides are congruent. For the next triangle, we add 63 and 38 and subtract from 180. And that'll give us the answer. Our answer is 79 degrees. So this is very similar to our previous example. Let's skip down and do a couple of other ones. And then you can try the rest on your own and check the answer sheet. So let's look at the next one actually. Here we know that this angle is x. Well, this is an isosceles triangle. It's showing us that. Therefore, we know that this angle x is the same as this angle over here. So I'm going to put x degrees there. So I can actually set up an equation. X plus 50 equals 180, kind of like our word problem at the beginning. And so we end up with 2x plus 50 equals 180. Subtract 50 from both sides. 2x equals 130. So I subtracted 50 from both sides to get 2x by itself. Divide both sides by 2. And when I do that, I get x equals 65 degrees. So I know both of those angles are 65. So this is an isosceles triangle. It's also still an acute triangle. So try the next three and then check your answers. Let's move on to solving triangles. So in this example, we're trying to figure out the measures of x and y. Well, in the top triangle, we know we have a right angle. So we know that these three add up to 180. So 90 plus 30 is 120 plus 60 is going to be 180. So this angle right here is 60 degrees. Well, the angle where we see x written right here, is vertical to 60 degrees. So that means that x also has to be 60 degrees due to vertical angles. And then y, again, we have to add 60 and 90, and we get 150. Subtract 180 minus 150, and that gives us 30 degrees for y. In our next example, we have two isosceles triangles. It's always good to stop and figure out what kind of triangles you have. Well, this right here has to be 30 degrees since the other angle is 30 degrees and it's an isosceles triangle. Well, since this one's 30 and that one's 30, that adds up to 60. 180 minus 60 is 120. So this angle is 120. So this is an obtuse triangle where this top angle is 120 degrees. Well, x and 120 are supplementary to each other. So 120 plus 60 equals 180. So x has to be 180 or 60 to give us 180. This next triangle is also isosceles. So this angle must be 60 degrees so that the two bottom angles are congruent since they're across from the two congruent sides. 60 and 60 is 120, so 180 minus 120 is 60. That gives us the degree measure for y. So this triangle is actually an equilateral triangle. The next picture, you can try on your own, as well as the following picture, and compare to your answers. Let's look at the following word problem. In an obtuse triangle, one of the acute angles is 6 less than 4 times the other. If the obtuse angle is 98 degrees, find the measure of the two acute angles. So the first thing I'm going to do is write down what I know. I know that angle 1 is 98 degrees, or whatever I want to call my angles. Angle 2 is something and angle 3 is something. We always base one angle that we don't know off another angle that we don't know. So I'm just going to let angle 2 be x. And so angle 3 is 6 less than 4 times x. All this adds up to equal 180. So I'm going to add 98 degrees plus x degrees plus 4x minus 6 degrees equals 180 degrees. But I don't have to write my degrees symbols into my equation. I'm going to add my like terms, so 98 plus negative 6 is 92, and x plus 4x is 5x. So I end up with 5x plus 92 equals 180. From there, I just continue to solve this equation, and that allows me to find the measures of all the angles.